Good evening, and thank you for joining me for the last of this year's Wine and a Book 2025 and Indie Author Week UK 2025. And sorry, the computer's giving me some weird messages. Right, so, and wishing you all the very best of health, and cheers. Tonight, I'm sort of pulling together snippets from my work in progress. And I'm hoping that fiddling about with the computer, I can still see what I'm reading from so that I can wave some photos around on the phone. The book that the snippets are coming from is my forthcoming Sitting in Their Landscape, the churches, chapels and ruins of the South Downs National Park. And it's about them sitting in their landscape. It's about the roads and the lanes and a bit of the history. There's 273 churches, chapels and ruin places of worship. So each of them get a page. So there's a lot to pack into a small space. It's been a fascinating journey of all sorts of weird and wonderful things. So the methodology was to choose the churches and places of worship from the Ordnance Survey maps as they're plotted, which means that the Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Halls go in as a postscript at the end. And also the tithe maps. And a friend of mine said, I know what a tithe map is, she does, but most people don't. So what's a tithe map? In 1836, it comes into the East Meon thing, but in 1836 there was the Tithe Commutation Act, and that meant that the money that was paid to the rectors, the vicars and the curates each gets a different amount of money, different proportion of the money, and there's an advisor and a patron and all sorts of people get money out of all this system. And the genealogist website hosts the government copy of the tithe maps, and that's online. And I've had a wonderful time being able to look up all the maps that relate to all these churches, because going and looking at fantastic, they're beautiful. Tithe maps can be stunning. The ones on the genealogist website aren't stunning, but they're very informative. And they have an apportionment that goes with them, which gives the names of the owners and the occupiers of the land, and field names and parcel sizes and land use. So it's full of information, and they date to some 1837 through to 1853, I think that's the window of time. And that was such a catalyst of change for churches in particular, but the countryside as a whole, with agricultural changes and people going more to the cities and less from the country. So virtually each church I've been able to establish who the rector or the vicar or the curate were. Right. So they're sort of in date order, sort of. So the Saxon church at Chithurst, which is a gorgeous little church, is between Midhurst and Petersfield on the A272, or just to the north of the A272. Life in Chithurst for a churchman wasn't exactly kind. In 1757, the rector, the Reverend John Denham, was murdered by a man called Apps, who may have been a smuggler, who stabbed him intentionally, not by accident. Apparently, it was the result of a festering reaction to some harsh words spoken unthinkingly by the rector 5 years earlier. So Woolbeading is not far from Petworth. So it's actually next to National Trust House. That's, I think every now and then the gardens are open to the public. Another Saxon church, and it's got what are called pilasters, the stripy bits down the side of the building. The tithe map dates to 1839. This unravels a complex tale, and it is quite, yeah. The Reverend John Bouverie was the rector living in the rectory. They didn't always live in the rectory, sometimes they lived elsewhere. Interestingly, Woolbeading House was owned by Sir Henry Frederick Bouverie, KCB, and Charles George Beauclerk, Esquire, as trustees under the will of the late Robert Spencer. The occupier is identified as the Honourable George Ponsonby. Lord Spencer had married Harriet Bouverie after her husband Edward Bouverie died. She was Sir Henry and John Bouverie's mother. Her daughter, their sister, Diana Bouverie, who was probably Spencer's child, according to gossip and the fact that he left Woolbeading to her, married the Honourable George Ponsonby, who became Lord Egremont's heir at Petworth. Hence, George Ponsonby being in the house next door. John Bouverie was also rector at Midhurst from 1808 to 1855. Saxo-Norman, where probably the same workmen were working for the Normans as had been working for the Saxons. So we sort of tend to think of history in defined chunks, but human beings straddle it. Like quite a lot of us were born before the year 2000. So we come from last century. I always thought that sounded weird with my grandparents. Ha, ha, ha. Right, South Stoke. It's an extraordinary building. It looks Victorian, but actually it's not. It's Saxo-Norman. The tithe map dates to 1834 with the apportionment in 1843, so 9 years later. The Reverend W.A. Wegelin was in the large parsonage, which is next door, which the listed building entry says was built in 1740 by the Reverend Daniel Gittins. Reverend Wegelin's son was the artist John Reynard Wegelin, Royal Horticultural Society, while his daughter, in inverted commas, was the scandalous Lady Smith. Her mother, his wife, was kicked out of the vicarage while pregnant and subsequently divorced on the grounds of adultery. Reverend Wegelin was then able to remarry a less flamboyant wife. His brother was governor of the Bank of England. Right, so now we get to the Normans and the very Norman St. Cross, which is a fantastic almshouse set up at Winchester. The tithe map dates to 1841. The church appears not identified separately from the rectory. Oh, hang on, that's not St. Cross. Sorry, rewind. St. Cross. The tithe map is dated 1846. The church is marked as in the parish of St. Faith, Winchester, with Chilcombe over the river. Francis North, Earl of Guildford, son of the Bishop of Winchester, was rector from 1829. Anthony Trollope's book, The Warden, was inspired by the large revenue that he received in his post, which caused rather a stir. That's rather an understatement, and I may have to explain that a bit more, mightn't I? But anyway, it did cause a stir in the newspapers. He unlike the warden, he was found innocent, Francis North. Right, Martyr Worthy. That's where I was going wrong. Oh, Martyr Worthy. So I've got a card of that we made. And it's reflecting the window. The tithe map dates to 1841. The church appears not identified separately from the rectory and all the paths integrated with it, but on the apportionment is given its own number. The long-term rector was the Reverend Sir Henry Rivers Bart. The rectory was large and housed his 5 sons and 8 daughters. It is still there. It's a building. There's a report that he got so upset at a young lad running naked in the river, alongside the River Itchen after a river swim near to one of his daughters, that the injuries that he gave the lad got him taken to court and fined. Right, East Meon. It's a fantastically beautiful church. And of course, yeah. One of several identified as Cathedral of the Downs. Alfriston is another. And there is one. There might have been one in West Sussex. Anyway, East Meon. The vicar in 1852 was the jaw-dropping pluralist. I think the tithe map was 1852. Interesting that it was late. The Reverend Thomas Cook Kemp. In 1831, at a time of deep agricultural struggle, Kemp attempted to increase his income by insisting that tithes be paid for some turnip tops that were being used by tenants to feed their animals. This led to a major row and the 1835 Tithing of Turnips Act. Reverend Kemp had been made vicar in 1826, and soon after he came, there was an increase in dissenting nonconformist chapels in the village, and there was certainly 3, if not more. It is a large village, but even so, he had 2 curates and was accused of molesting one of the family's servants in 1827. Although he won the case, he did have to pay the costs, which seems unusual. It was in the time of the swing riots that he went for the turnip tops, a risky time to be greedy. He had chapelries at Steep and Froxfield Green, which were served by his curates, and died in 1867. Also in 1836, so that's a year after the tithing of turnips, came the Tithe Commutation Act. In response to the unrest that the actions of people like the Reverend Kemp had triggered at a time of poor harvests and high unemployment. It was also necessary to iron out some confusions following earlier commutations from enclosure acts. This act, in turn, led to the production of the tithe maps and their apportionments, allowing money payments for most parishes across England and Wales that are of major help to many researchers and certainly to me. Over my entire career, they've been massively, massively helpful. All right, Selborne, the land of Gilbert White. But also another very contentious incumbent. So when we went there, poor old Selborne was under scaffolding, so taking photographs was actually quite tough. The tithe map dates to 1842 and unearths quite a tale. The Reverend Frederick James Parson was the vicar, but only recently appointed. He was in post from 1842 to 1875. Reverend Parson was considered to be more active and positive than his predecessor, who had fallen out with his parishioners over tithe payments and poor relief. pews were replaced and the three-decker pulpit went as well. He arranged for William White, a great-nephew of Gilbert White, to be the architect for repairs in 1856, and some yew was included in the work. The previous vicar was a shocker, another shocker. One Reverend William Rust Cobbold. Cobbold was another cleric determined to claim his full tithes in spite of the period of agricultural decline that triggered the swing riots of 1830. In 1832, this erupted with attacks on the Selborne and Headley poorhouses, and poorhouses were not a focus of riots elsewhere, and the very near lynching of Cobbold due to his arrogant attitude and refusal to compromise or back down. And this was a genuine near lynching, not a newspaper tabloid version. The leader of the Selborne rioters, John Newland, was known as the trumpeter, as he summoned his colleagues with a trumpet or horn. After the riots, he lived in the woods by Selborne Hanger by day, so evading arrest in spite of returning home at night. He has a modern memorial under the yew tree, poor old yew tree that's no more. Right, Linchmere, it's another one. So it's a cute little church up in the north of West Sussex, very, very close to the Surrey border. From 1777 until 1801, a notorious character, the Reverend James Fielding, was acting as curate at Linchmere, as well as having multiple livings elsewhere, including Cranley and Hazelmere. He lived in Hazelmere in a fancy house with his second wife, who was 18 when he married her at 57. He was also a JP and almost certainly a highwayman. To the north lie the Surrey heathlands and the Portsmouth Road, the line of the modern A3, a dangerous place to cross in the 18th century. The Reverend Fielding is thought to have had an involvement with a notorious robbery on Hindhead at the Devil's Punch Bowl, still marked by the gibbet in the woods, and I used to have to go walking past it when I was working up at Hindhead. Two highwaymen also worked for him, and he was the presiding JP for Surrey, so they had his protection when they attacked that side. But he was not a JP in Sussex, and that got them hung for mail robbery. After Reverend Fielding's death, mail sacks were found in one of his many houses that had been bought on the diverted proceeds of poor relief funds. Not a good man. Right, so now we come on to better folk. But it just happens it's that way. So Grapham is up on the scarp. Oh gosh, up on the scarp in West Sussex. The tithe map is dated 1841. There is also an update from 1848, and together these show the bones of a complex family story that impacted on the church in England and also a little bit of science history, I suppose. The Reverend Henry Edward Manning is shown as the rector. He was also rector of Woollavington, now East Lavington Seaford College, and lived along the Underhill Path there. He had been curate of Grapham in 1833 for a few months and lived there with the Reverend John Sargent until he became rector himself on Reverend Sargent's death, also in 1833, so it was a very short time. But the Reverend Manning then married Caroline, one of Sargent's daughters, although sadly she died only a few years later in 1837. Reverend Sargent had built the rectory in about 1805. Prior to that, the church was very isolated below the Downland Scarp. Neighbouring buildings were owned by Mary Sargent in 1842. As Reverend Sargent's widow, she had inherited significant lands. By 1848, the ownership was officially in the name of the Lord Bishop of Oxford, Dr. Samuel Wilberforce. Mary was first cousin to William Wilberforce, Samuel's father, the important anti-slavery campaigner. Reverend Sargent had been close friends with Henry Thornton, and my great-grandparents met as servants to Henry Thornton's son, and William Wilberforce. Samuel was married to another of their daughters, Emily, and as the eldest surviving child, she had inherited the estate. This is such a tale of who knew and was connected to who. The Reverend John Sargent was friends with many of the anti-slavery campaigners, as well as William Gladstone. His curate, the Reverend Henry Edward Manning, was the son of a slave owner, although his ministry was rooted in his own humanity. In 1851, the long-bereaved Manning's soul-searching led him to convert to Roman Catholicism, and he was to become an early Catholic cardinal in 1875. Grafham was restored in 1875 as a memorial to his brother-in-law, Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, who had become Bishop of Winchester. Soapy Sam, famous for his objections to Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and of course was related as a cousin to his bride's mother. It needs family trees, doesn't it? Right, so East Dean and East Sussex. I think this is probably the most saintly of the vicars and curates and stuff. So it's not far from Beltute and Seven Sisters, and yeah. In the churchyard is the grave of a renowned local parson, Reverend Jonathan Darby, variously curate of Littlington, rector of Wilmington, and parson of Friston and East Dean, from 1692 to 1726, so early. Appalled by how many sailors and smugglers he was having to bury from shipwrecks, he created Parson Darby's hole in the soft chalk cliff, where he sat night after night, having set lights as a forerunner to the later lighthouses at Beltute and Beachy Head in order to warn ships. So it was an actual cave in the chalk, which is it's an extraordinary idea, given how when I worked at Sussex University, the students would map the cliff retreat, and the idea of being in a cave in those cliffs. But it was at the time where it was what I think it was the time of the Little Ice Age, so the cliffs would have been firmer than they are now because they've gone a bit soft. All right, Ringmer. Ringmer is just outside the national park. It's sort of there's a little sort of nibble. And there's the church. The tithe map is dated 1840. The Reverend John Constable was the vicar, with a curate, the Reverend John Lupton. Reverend Constable was vicar from 1812 to his death in 1863 and resident, not quite sure how that works. In 1813, his dog had been found in Lewes at the bottom of School Hill, suffering from rabies. He lived at Middleham. His curate Lupton, also rector of Cliff, lived in the vicarage. So if only the dog lasted long. Right, it's so good that rabies is no longer a problem. And the last one, I've taken a long time because I've been showing the photos. The last one is Willingdon. The tithe map is dated 1843. This is a sad one. The Reverend Henry James was the vicar, living with, there's the church. Living with others in the parsonage next door to the church. Reverend James sadly died from a fall at Beachy Head in 1850, aged 37, at a site then called Gun Gardens, but later called the Devil's Chimney. He had attempted to climb down the cliff, possibly looking for fossils, at first showing off to a fellow vicar and his own daughter, but shockingly he didn't make it down as slowly as he planned, and he is buried in the churchyard. Oh no, one more, Itchen Abbas. Yeah, right. This is a Victorian church on the site of an earlier church. So the tithe map is dated 1839, so shows the old church. Reverend Robert Wright was the rector. He was a controversial clerical magistrate who had 5 parishes. He was rector from 1804 to his death in 1850, with his son as his curate until 1836. The church was totally rebuilt in 1867 in the time of his successor, the Reverend William Webb Spicer. Reverend Wright was also chaplain to the Duke of Buckingham and a friend of Lord Palmerston's. Apparently, he used to spend the winter at Southwick and summer at Itchen Abbas, right next to the River Itchen. In spite of the pluralism, he was known as the poor man's friend, evidenced by his actions following the theft of a horse by a local gypsy known as John Hughes in 1825. The trial and hanging took place in London, and Reverend Wright tried to stop the hanging, purchasing his body in order to be able to bury him in Itchen Abbas churchyard. The grave is under the fine ancient yew tree that may have been close to the collapsed east end of the old church. So thank you for joining me for a spattering of tales of interesting and different expectations. We have a very different expectation of our clergy these days, and only one of them had the sort of thing that gets a bad name. Most are very, very fine and decent people, and that should be remembered. Bad eggs should not be the ones that get the bad name for the good people ever in anything. Thank you very much for joining me and for watching these, and I will try and put them up so that they're videos rather than lives. So hello to anybody who's watching this in the future, which I hope they will be doing, and your health and happiness, and thank you. And I will report on in various videos on the progress towards publication for the book. Good night and thank you.